You can hang to the side, whatever is easiest for you. You can sit here.
I know, right? Very rare. Very rare.
So welcome, everyone. Everyone can hear? So for those who I don't know, my name is Rabbi Mark Katz. I'm the rabbi here at Temple Ner Tamid, and I want to officially welcome everyone. Before we begin, two specific thank yous that I want to make, and then I want to just say a word or two before I turn it over to Leo, who's going to be introducing our two speakers for tonight. The first is, this is part of a speaker series that we've been doing for a really long time, really for 4 years at this point. This, by the way, is the second time that Representative Sherrill has come back to our congregation through this series. And the brainchild of this series, it comes from Kerry Shavat, who really, with a lot of love, has made sure that our community understands that the way to deal with justice, the way to make change, is to understand that politics and policy is the avenue to make this world a better place. I also want to thank Jill Hirsch, who's a member of our congregation, who was the liaison with Kerry to make tonight happen. So before we officially begin, I want to kind of frame why it is so important that we are here, and why it is so important that Temple Ner Tamid, our congregation, has taken tonight to host this important conversation. In our tradition, we understand that democracy is a fragile thing, right? Peace, by the way, in our tradition is often associated with what is called the Sukkah, right? And if you've ever been to Sukkot, the holiday that happens in the fall, you know that it's kind of a temporary dwelling that you build outside, that you sit in for 8 days. And if the wind blows too strong, that sukkah ends up being completely destroyed. It is upended. And there are a lot of things in our life that one could call a sukkah. Our tradition calls peace a sukkah, but we've more than ever realized that actually some of the things that we hold true for ourselves, especially our democracy, the spirit of what it means to live in a country, is itself as fragile as that sukkah. If the wind blows too hard, it could all topple over. Now, the Jewish tradition understands that every single voice in a community matters, just as a democracy understands the same thing. When Moses gave his famous last will and testament to the Jewish people right before he died, he made a point to say that all of you are gathered in front of me, from the chieftains and the leaders of the tribes, all the way down to the water carriers and all the way down to the wood choppers. And the idea being that a society is made up of diversity of opinion, socioeconomic diversity, in our country, racial diversity, ethnic diversity, diversity of view, and that a community is not a community unless every single one of those views is honored, every single one of those views is held up, every single one of those views is listened to. Democracy is made on the basis of understanding that our community is a diverse community where every voice should matter. And we've seen over the course of these past few years as that spirit has come under attack, as it's been challenged. And so tonight, one of the things that we were excited about when Representative Sherrill got in touch and said that the theme of tonight was going to be looking at the many different ways that democracy manifests in our country, is that at the end of the day, if every single one of us matters, then democracy is held up. And that for us, at least, and for me as a rabbi who sees a diverse community both within these walls and outside, it becomes all the more so to know just how deeply it is that every voice will matter. And so without further ado, I want to invite one of our students, or one of our 10th graders, Leo Hirsch, who's going to introduce the night.
Boker Tov. Oh, never mind. I'm Leo. I'm 15 years old, and I've been going to Temple near Tamid for many years. I've also known Mikey Sherrill for many years. I first met her at my bus stop in elementary school.
She was driving the bus?
Yeah, she's very talented. She was always kind and considerate and let me to go to her house after school every day, which I would not do. I was a very annoying little kid. She decided to run for Congress to make change in her community, and she has worked hard to do so and still has a lot more to do. Mikey is someone who cares about protecting people and their rights and has been serving New Jersey's 11th district in Congress for 4 years and is hoping to be elected for another term. She's a Navy helicopter pilot, a federal prosecutor, a mom, and to me, a friend and someone I look up to. Our other speaker is Paul Fishman. Paul has been serving our country for decades. He served as United States Attorney for the District of New Jersey for 8 years. He was also Mikey's boss when she was an assistant U.S. attorney. He's also a member of our temple, and I'm excited to hear their conversation today. So,
That was awesome. All right.
All right. You want to start, or you want to open, or do you want me to like start firing questions?
So this is how much I love Temple Near to Me that I keep coming back again and again and again, despite the fact that Carrie keeps pairing me with Paul Fishman. But no, it's
If you
wonderful
want
to
a
be here. Yeah.
different short Jewish man, there are plenty of us here.
I'll call Jim afterwards. He's already.
He's around. Well, it's great to be here, and I just want to thank you. I want to thank you for having me. I want to thank you for coming out tonight. I want to especially thank all the people who brought their children and all the kids who are out tonight. I think that's really wonderful because as we talk about democracy, we're thinking about the future and what it's going to look like in this country, and so it's so important. I want to thank Jeff Plout. Thank you very much for coming out. The Hirsch family in force. Thank you so much, Carrie. And I thought, I don't know if I have seen Lori. I think Lori was going to come, but Lori Price Abrams, but I haven't seen her yet, so she might come in a little bit. And then so many people, hi. Hi, Wad Chung and Lacrosse family. So it's just great to be here with so many people. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. So I feel like I was here like 2 or 3 weeks ago. It was Rosh Hashanah. So this is the second time I've had the treat of doing this kind of event with my good friend Mikey. And I'll just tell you a little bit for a couple minutes about how we met. I was, as Leo said, by the way, Leo, where are you in the back now? That hair is spectacular. And both the rabbi and I are insanely jealous of that. When I was the United States Attorney, back in what I consider the light ages, in the Obama administration, I was working for two fellows you've heard of, a guy named Obama and a guy named Holder, and they were very interested in having the U.S. attorneys, who are the chief federal prosecutors, the chief federal law enforcement officers all over the country, do something other than just investigate and put people in jail. That's the traditionally hard, sort of center core of what that office does as the field prosecutors for the United States Department of Justice. But as lots of people, including my friend Loretta Lynch, used to say, the United States Department of Justice is the only cabinet agency in the federal government that's named for a value and not for what it actually does. And so the Attorney General, then Attorney General Holder and President Obama wanted the U.S. attorneys, as the highest ranking members of the executive branch, to do more, to be the emissaries of the United States Department of Justice in other ways. And honestly, I felt myself incredibly strapped. I had an office of 150 lawyers and a bunch of other people to supervise, and I needed somebody to help me do that. And I was lucky enough to be introduced to Mikey. She was actually looking for a job at that time as to be a new federal prosecutor, but I had a different idea. And so for the first 3 years that Mikey was in my office, she was effectively the advance person, the community outreach coordinator, the first one we'd ever had. in the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey to communities all over New Jersey, synagogues, mosques, churches, the LGBT community, environmental advocacy groups, people who are involved in animal rights, basically everything you can think of in which the Justice Department could play a role, not just protecting people by keeping them safe in the traditional way, but helping to protect people by letting the Justice Department know that we had their backs. And you know, when you do that kind of job, A, you get to see what's going on in New Jersey, which it turns out has served her enormously well. You get to see what's good and what's bad, what people's problems are. But for me, aside from having a spectacular person with a wonderful background do that, I got to spend basically 3 years in the car, driving around the state of New Jersey with my
Being driven.
well, to be fair, but that's before you were a congresswoman. And I was so, and we spent a lot of time together talking about a lot of those issues, and we became very good friends. And so when she told me she was going to run for Congress, I was quick to sign up to help her out. And now we've had a couple of these conversations in public and in private, and it's a really great thing for me. So my first question for you, Mikey, is what did you learn from that Justice Department job, aside from what a pain in the ass I am in the car? What did you learn at that Department of Justice job, reaching out, that has helped you be better at what you're doing now?
Well, you know what I learned at that job and what I've learned in the Navy as well, working with different people from all over the world and all different backgrounds, is to really understand individuals as individuals, apart from their religion, apart from their race, apart from their background. I will tell you that part of my job was helping people coming out of federal prison. And I didn't know a lot of people who had been in federal prison. I couldn't really think of people I knew before I worked at that job who'd been in federal prison. And it's easy to make them other. But I'll tell you, as I got to working on the prisoner reentry program, people coming out of federal prison and helping them successfully reenter our communities, first of all, I read a lot of background. You have a background report that the probation officers put together. And so it goes deep into the history, not just the criminal history, but the personal history of the people that were coming out of prison. And man, you sort of look at that and you think, there but for the grace of God. You know, if I had two parents that were drug abusers, victims of AIDS and died from AIDS, and then I was raised by an alcoholic grandparent, where would I be today? And what would I do in that life? And then you also get to know the individuals as you're helping them, because you so desperately want people to succeed. You get very invested in the lives of these mostly men that you're working with, and seeing how their life impacts so many other lives. Because if they can be successful, it's going to make a huge impact on their children, their significant other, their community members, to see a role model like that. So you really start to see individuals for who they are, and try to think of ways that we're all able to work together to achieve what's best for our community and our nation. And when the rabbi spoke about how the Jewish values of individuality lined up with the democratic values, that really spoke to me, because I've had cause over the past several years to think about why I believe so deeply in democracy and what it is about this form of government, above all other forms of government, that means so much to me. And it's really occurred to me, and you think, oh, you know, that I probably figured it out on day one, right? But you sort of have a knee-jerk, kind of maybe even elementary school, oh, it's democracy, it's the best, you have the freedoms, and it's important. But I think as you go a little deeper, you realize that it's the one form of government that places trust and importance on the individual, and believes that it's important, the voice that each individual has is important in our society. And we give each individual a vote to have say over what happens in our society. And so you believe deeply in each individual, but then you also believe deeply that that individual has a responsibility to the whole, because they're making choices for all of us, and together we can do better. And I'll tell you, as I've had the opportunity to see what it looks like when you don't believe in individuals, when you think an autocrat can rule over everyone. Basically, you're talking about Putin. You're talking about all the economic pieces of your government going to the top and oligarchs. You're talking about one person making decisions, and you're talking about going to jail if you disagree with that one person. And so I hate war. And then I'll give it back to you because I've diverged very far from the question. But I'll just tell you, as I've seen in Ukraine, the people fighting for freedom, I've had people say, we should not encourage this because war is so awful. And I've said, you know, I hate war. I think veterans hate war than almost anybody else in the world because we know the cost of war. But the fact of the matter is the Ukrainian people know the cost of war, and they have made the calculation that living with freedom, that investing in individuals, that the future they see for their children under that form of government is worth the cost that they're paying right now to stand up against the form of government that Putin would envision for them. So any more questions?
No, I think we're basically done. You covered my entire list. It's totally fine. If there was the judge here, so Your Honor, would you please ask the witness to answer the question? I'm not going to do that. So you've been to Ukraine twice. Mm-hmm. You're on the Armed Services Committee. There was, for many months, considerable, I would say almost consensus, even on the Hill, about the Ukrainian aid. But there seem to be cracks in that now appearing, particularly on the Republican side of the House. What's the reason for that? What's the cost? And what did you see there that convinces you that we're actually on the right road?
I think there's several reasons, some more nefarious than others. There were, even very early on, some odd signs as we were supporting Ukraine or thinking that we were going to support Ukraine. Some odd pockets of support for Putin, as you recall, from people like Tucker Carlson. And I had some fear that the far right, as they've done on several occasions, would be able to bully the Republican Party into a path that I thought was anti-democratic and anti-American. And so even really early on, we saw some of those fissures. They did not hold sway. And I think as we came together as a community of nations, with our NATO allies, with our European allies, our democratic allies, and really put our support behind Ukraine, I think we were acting largely in our government as one, and it was largely bipartisan. We saw that with the vote. We started to see some of the vote fall off with the second package, and now we're hearing Kevin McCarthy, who many people think will be the next leader of the Republican conference in the House. I think he believes he'll be the next leader of the Republican conference in the House, certainly. And he has said that he is going to defund Social Security and Medicare and Ukraine. And those are kind of, he's threatened to hold the debt ceiling hostage, which Moody's has said, I think, would result in about 600 million jobs lost in our economy. It was the only time the United States credit rating has been dinged when the Republicans did this the last time. So that seems like a very bad plan, especially for a somewhat fragile economy right now, to think that that's what he's running on. So you would think, is he really running on, and does he really anticipate Republicans will be running on defunding Social Security, Medicare, and Ukraine? I can't imagine, right? That sounds very unpopular. So I think he's running for the support of the Freedom Caucus. He's not running on a platform that he thinks is winnable. He's running on a platform that he thinks will get him the votes he needs to be in leadership. And what that says is you're kind of kowtowing to the Freedom Caucus. Now, I think there are members of the Freedom Caucus who are very Trumpy and who Trump likes Putin, so they like Putin. I don't know if there's any more corruption to it. I think there's something going on. You know, we see a lot of misinformation, and I don't know that it's simple misinformation to members, or if it's something more nefarious again. But there's also a very insular, nationalistic group of Republicans who simply don't want to spend the money and don't see why we would spend the money to support Ukraine. It's a lot of money. And my response to that, so that gets to kind of why we're starting to see this coalition, a bipartisan coalition, kind of falter a little as we go forward. And I'll just say two more things quickly, why I believe it's important to support Ukraine and how we will continue support for Ukraine even if we lose the majority, I think. I think it's important that we support Ukraine for many, many reasons. One of them is because, as I've kind of expressed, my deep belief in democracy. And I think it is, as we are the leader of democratic nations, I think it is up to us to stand up to people who would take over a country and their democracy, co-opt them, if you will, in their sovereign nation. But I also think, as importantly, as we've gone to do this, we now have a stronger relationship with our NATO allies than we've had in quite some time. And I think it's important economically. Before COVID, under Trump backed away from our international alliances, and we were very weak globally. So when we saw, for example, some of the, if you will, rules of the road being negotiated for things like 5G and how we would proceed going forward, what the international rules would be, the United States, we'd sort of been largely successful historically. We were losing out to China. We were seeing China become predominant in those areas, and that was going to continue to get worse if we had not coalesced the nations around democracy and the fight for individual rights. And I think this has pointed out to some of our allies that, one, we're back, we're willing to be leaders of democracy, and two, there is a strong democratic push internationally that's important, and what it looks like when you don't stand up for those rights and what might be the future. Finally, I would say, for those of you who are like thinking to yourselves, well, are we going to be able to continue to support Ukraine? My suspicion is yes. My suspicion is that if we lose the majority in the House, that in the lame duck session, we still have a couple months before the new Congress is seated, that we will, with bipartisan actual majorities, pass a Ukraine package, because McCarthy's attempt to defund Ukraine, or stated a desire to defund Ukraine, is not universal. McConnell's been against it, Pence has been against it. It's not something where there's cohesion. So I do think, seeing that that would be a big break in the party, they would love for the Democrats to rescue them and sort of just pass this before they go into leadership. Would be my guess.
So there are two things that you mentioned in that answer and the one before that I want to touch on for a minute. One is misinformation or disinformation, which we're going to come back to in a minute. But you talked about the idea of autocratic governments. You talked about the relationship between Trump and Putin, or their mutual, at least in Trump's case, affection for Putin. I'm not quite sure how Putin feels about Trump. But okay, we're here. We're in the United States, and there are an enormous number of things that are going on that are scaring the pants off a lot of people about the future of democracy. There's election denying. There are people running for secretaries of state and governors of states who are bent on, say, debunking the validity of the voting system. We have all of January 6th, which we probably will spend a little time on. But and you're a student of history. I mean, you and I talked a lot about your career in the Naval Academy, your time in the Naval Academy, and what you saw as you were in Europe and the Middle East when you were in the Navy. Where are we on this chronological development or devolution of democracy in America?
So there are studies of democracy that we've generally developed to study other nations, and for the first time, the United States has sort of fallen off a bit and not seen as fully democratic right now for various reasons on some of the studies. But I guess I don't look at where we are in the devolution. I look at where we're headed in the evolution, because as I keep quoting Madeleine Albright, I'm an optimist who worries a lot. So, I am an optimist.
By the way, that is spectacularly Jewish. Which is why we all knew she was Jewish to begin with, even though she didn't know she was Jewish to begin with.
She didn't know,
exactly.
Yeah.
Now you could be Jewish.
You guys knew. You guys knew.
The rabbi's doing an adult bar mitzvah class.
So there we have it. There we have it. I'm in already. It sounds like I don't need it.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm already there. I would say that, there are odd things that I take comfort in. So I will share them with you, and you guys can take them for what they're worth. There are a couple things. I was in we call it the gallery section of the House of Representatives. So I'm in the gallery on January 6th, and it was the last place to be evacuated. And, as we were trying to get out, we were blockaded, and there were people on the ground on zip ties as we got out. So we've really become a tight group of people. And we have a text chain. And as I always say, members of Congress are really good at alliteration. So it's called the Gallery Group. And then I looked at it recently, and someone had changed the title. It says it's the Gallery Group, AKA the Balcony Bunch. And I thought, we are good at alliteration. Look at that. So we had been talking, and it came upon the year anniversary of that event. And we decided we wanted to commemorate it. So we all went down to Washington. We weren't in session, but we decided to all go to Washington that day to be together and commemorate it. And we heard from some historians, including John Meacham, and he presented some of the darkest days of our history. And what was so interesting to me, Paul's a little bit kind calling me a student of history. I have a history degree from that vaunted liberal arts school, the Naval Academy. So we'll see. But we were talking, he was talking about these moments in history. And what is interesting, if you've studied history, is this sense, and you don't even realize you're doing it, but as you're going through our history, which you hear again and again, this sense of inevitability, that it was all going to work out because we're a democracy and we always end up as a democracy. And yet as he was presenting these moments, it wasn't clear to the people at the time that it would work out. They were very, very worried at different times in our nation's history that they were going to lose the democracy. In fact, even as you study it, when you delve kind of deeper into it, it does look like these were really dangerous times. And what he said was, but despite all of it, despite forces acting against democracy, despite people in power acting against democracy, despite large groups of people who control different portions of the media or ideas in our culture moving away from democracy, there were always enough people in this nation that believed in our values, and we were able to make sure we move forward in a democratic form of government. And it's been comforting to me to hear some of these stories because, I guess when I look back at our nation's history, I grew up in a time period largely devoid of these fights. I was born about 50 years ago. Roe had just been implemented or was about to be implemented. The Vietnam War was over. The civil rights movement was drawing to a close despite continued fights. But the large upheavals of the 60s were kind of ending. And then we were just sort of fighting the Russians, right? And that was a Cold War. So it was really just making sure everybody knew how bad things were behind the Iron Curtain and how lucky we were to be Democrats. So there wasn't a lot of argument over it. And so to come to a point in our nation's history where it feels so fragile has been shocking to me and bewildering. So to hear that we've had this time in our nation's history, I find comforting because we've made it through those times. I'm also listening right now. I don't know if any of you are listening, and Jill says I just say this so I can act like I'm cool and listen to podcasts when I've listened to one. But I'm listening to this podcast called Ultra, which is by Rachel Maddow, and details a very dark time in our nation's history with some things that kind of are parallels to what we're facing today. And knowing that despite how bad that was, there were individuals, and that's what gives me great hope is so many times there are these brilliant individuals. There's this one gentleman I've heard about, and there was this Nazi propaganda going around, and this one Jewish gentleman who had been a disabled veteran from World War I actually puts together this collection of people to go spy on the Nazi people and is and getting the best evidence that, and by the time the FBI kind of gets ready to do something, they're using all of his files that he's made a personal CIA group to get information on and infiltrate. So It's these individuals that have made a big difference. So I know that all of us can stand in the breach. And I know that we are going to be enough. Because when you look at these numbers, they're a very loud minority. They're a very scary minority. It's very scary what's going on in our country. There's a lot of people in that minority with a lot of power in our country. But they are a minority. I'd say roughly, I think most people estimate that the MAGA Republicans are less than 30% of the people in the nation. So if we stay with this, if we keep fighting this fight, we're going to win this one. I mean, it is a democracy still, and we are in the majority still. So that gives me a great deal of hope as I kind of look forward to where we are now. We're not in a great place, but we've got the forces to get to that great place, and I think we will.
So I haven't listened to Ultra yet. I'm still in the middle of Bagman, her last podcast, which is actually about assistant U.S. attorneys who are heroes, right? And bringing down Spiro Agnew, and since you ended up, by the way, after Mikey did the outreach thing that I hired her to do, she eventually prevailed upon me to actually hire her as an assistant U.S. attorney. She was very good at that job, and then she decided to run for Congress. So, I'll give you an example of one thing that's like totally wigged me out in the last 2 days or 3 days, right? We all know the horrible thing that happened to Nancy Pelosi's husband, right? A guy breaks into a house with a hammer, breaks the glass with a hammer, goes in the house, attacks this 80-year-old man, hits him in the head, sends him to the hospital. It's horrible, right? You can be on a zillion Twitter accounts now, or other almost mainstream media accounts, and see these crazy conspiracy theories about Paul Pelosi having been naked and invited the guy into his house, and there was a third person there, none of which is borne out by the videos that the Capitol Police actually have of the outside of the house. Where are we in your work as a member of Congress in dealing with this very complicated and thorny issue of free speech versus dangerous speech? Because I know you've thought about that. We talked about this issue some.
So I believe deeply in free speech. And it's really interesting because when I was working on outreach, I remember I was working with a Muslim group. And I think it was when someone in France had put in the newspaper a cartoon about Muhammad that was very offensive to the Muslims in France. And I believe that journalist was shot and killed. And I remember
there was an attack at the magazine. I'm not sure whether the journalist himself
but there was an attack.
I'm looking at Jody, who would definitely know. They attacked the magazine's offices, right?
And I remember a gentleman from this group coming up to me and saying, well, certainly that would never happen here. They wouldn't print that now because they know, they know how offensive that would be, and they wouldn't do that. And I said, no. That's not true. The sense here in this country is that you shouldn't have people weighing in as an arbitrator of what people get to see and how people think, because it is through allowing free speech and seeing all the ideas that we come to the best decisions, but also that we don't want somebody else making the choice as to what we see and don't see, because we would rather have too much information out there than have our information curtailed and be led by someone in power. And so I said, no, I think it would be the exact opposite. People here would double down. I wouldn't be surprised if newspapers in solidarity printed audacious things. But what has happened, so you have that on one side, right? This deep belief that if we allow government to decide what you get to see and what is right and what is wrong and what is true and what is not, what happens when you have President Trump deciding that? So we have real concerns about that, and I think our founding fathers had real concerns about that. But then on the other side, you have this idea that a well-educated public is necessary to democracy, because we're all making decisions on how this country runs. And by well-educated public, we would assume that would in part mean educated with facts not misinformation. And so how do you balance those two things? And I think where we are behind and what is scary right now is something called Section 230. And that was a decision very early on in the internet to decide that you can't hold anyone, if you don't curate the content of your website, then you can't be held liable for anything on your website. If you just sort of say, I'm not curating the post, people can post whatever they want, then it's not your fault. But now we see these really bad algorithms. We know that, I can tell you people in Silicon Valley send their kids to these low-tech schools that don't even have computers because they know how dangerous these algorithms are. They have done so many studies to light up the brain to the point where this woman who was studying the birth of white nationalism in some area of the country, she said, and you can find this book on Amazon, and oh, by the way, because of the algorithms, if you order that book, you can find about 10 other books on white nationalism, should you choose to do that. That is the pathway that you get led down now. So we really do have to do something about Section 230, holding people accountable for the information they're putting out, holding people accountable online, and finding a pathway forward, because right now, we have misinformation, we have foreign misinformation, we have people who believe things that are just patently false, and we have many of those people that are now creating a sense that our government isn't fair, that our election system isn't fair, that it's all made up, to the point where I just had a debate. And I have my one opponent who's putting out misinformation. I mean, he's putting out mailers with just things that are easily verifiable that are wrong. But then I have another third-party person who I was debating with, who I actually felt really sad listening to him, because he seemed like he could be a nice person, a nice neighbor, water your plants, watch your pets when you're out of town. And he was quoting Russian misinformation as if it was fact. He was saying that Zelensky was a puppet of the CIA and worth $7 billion, and that he wasn't fighting for democracy, it was all fake, and that the government is all a fraud and people are just there to enrich themselves, and that everything I say is fake. And he even said at the end, he's like, she's a very nice lady. I'm like, well, if you think do you think I'm just promoting all this crazy stuff? But the saddest part to me was, there's one thing to put out falsehoods because, you're not a truthful, honest person, or you don't have integrity. It's another thing to really believe what he believed. And I think he really believes the misinformation he's being fed. And that then becomes a danger to the very democracy itself. And so that's why I think we really have to look at the Section 230 and to start there.
It shows you, it's an example of a law that was passed by Congress, Section 230, that seemed like a really good idea at the time.
We promoted it globally too,
right,
because we didn't want to be like China,
right,
when they're curating the internet, right?
Exactly. It seemed like a really good idea at the time to protect all these internet providers from liability, and now maybe not such a great idea. So two things. One is, I know the rabbi's going to get the last word or question, so you should give me the high sign when it's time to do that, because I don't wear a watch anymore because I have a phone. I don't want to pull my phone out; it'll be rude. So, okay. But there are a couple of topics that I think we really should get to, and the first is Roe, because you did mention it early, you were having been warned just about the time the case was decided, and of course the court's decision in Dobbs overruling Roe, and this is it's a two-part question for me, and Mikey and I have talked about this a little bit too. I want to talk about the substance of the decision first and what you think it means, not so much for the election, because everybody has an idea about what it might or might not portend for voter turnout, but what do you think it means for, in your mind, for the concept of stare decisis, that once something is decided, it should stay that way, and precedent, and the legitimacy of the Supreme Court and how people perceive it, I think, and of course, what now with the reproductive rights and what Congress can do about it. So you only have like 4 minutes to do that. So that's.
So, and this would be something that would be really interesting for you to weigh in on as well. My sense is we've really been sort of slowly dismantling all of the things, the kind of courtesies we had in our government that made it a little more fair. Things such as not putting overly political Supreme Court justices on the bench, having some belief in stare decisis, and which, by the way, the Supreme Court justices said that they believed in, specifically with respect to Roe. And then you see these justices. I find, not only do I think the Roe decision itself was really scary, but I think the way the case was decided was really scary. And it was, I thought, what I keep saying, and this, if you're sort of somebody that likes to think that these decisions are made based on some legal belief or, precedent or line of cases, I thought this was very results oriented. Meaning they had decided what they wanted to do, the Supreme Court justices, and then they just made stuff up in our history to get it done. So what do I mean by that? They say basically you have to go back to the 1700s and the founding of our nation, and if it's in the founding of our nation, then this is a principle that stands, and if it's not, that you can't have protections for it. Now, why do, you might say, well, that, if that's the line, if that's what they think is the legal opinion, why do you think they're full of, what? Won't say it in the hallowed halls. Well, because there weren't assault rifles in the 1700s. So if you want to say, okay, we're going to go back to our nation's founding, obviously assault rifles are something that you can in fact ban. That is okay. Or saying that you're going to use this line of cases, well, guess what? This line of cases does not just touch upon abortion. It does not just touch upon contraception. It does not just touch upon gay marriage. It also touches upon mixed marriage or miscegenation laws. And that's something that is not part of this, right? That's specific, which it shouldn't be. None of it should be okay. But obviously, this is just a line that they've taken to say, this is what we want to do, and this is how we're going to torture the logic to make it happen. And so I've been having, real problems because basically, especially as a woman, this feels incredibly threatening to me. So
you didn't have so many rights in the 18th century.
We didn't have so many rights in the early days of our country. That's why we always hear about the founding fathers. So I find it really scary how they are trying to kind of embed in this some weird, I would say, revisionist view of our nation's founding, which evidently has a line of cases that would protect your right to open carry an assault weapon, but not your right to have reproductive health care.
I wonder, actually, if the 13th Amendment is the amendment that outlawed slavery. But if there were no 13th Amendment, if Congress had not passed the 13th Amendment, would slavery therefore still be legal under Justice Alito's analysis, right? Because it was legal until the 1860s. Their answer would be the 13th Amendment prohibits it, so we don't have to deal with that.
We don't have to deal with it.
But the logic is pretty compelling, which is kind of crazy. So I want to, so reproductive rights generally. So where are we? What can Congress do? What's likely to happen if the Republicans take the House? How is this rolling out?
We're in a really, really bad spot with reproductive rights and health care. We weren't in a great spot before Dobbs. So just basic women's health care is not in a good place in this country, and I've taken a deeper dive than you want to hear right now about why, and there are several reasons embedded in how we approached studying diseases and why. But I will tell you, reproductive health care in this country is not in a good place. There's just not a lot of information. So that was a starting point that was already not great. But now with the overturning of Roe, you don't have just basic protections. And what does that mean across the nation? Because maybe you're here in New Jersey and maybe you don't, you haven't seen some of what's going on in the rest of the nation. You could be forgiven for maybe not watching the news lately. So we are seeing cases where women having miscarriages are basically not being seen by doctors because it's hard to tell a miscarriage from a botched abortion. And doctors are afraid that they're going to be held liable if they accidentally treat someone going through a botched abortion in any way. So now you have women who are basically bleeding out, coming to emergency rooms, and in one horrible case, if you guys heard the Daily about this one, she was basically, her husband was told, you have to go, we can't treat her. And he said, well, she's bleeding profusely. They said, well, if she fills a diaper, then you can come back. He said, how long will I have? And they said something like, 30 minutes. He said, I live 40 minutes away. And they were like, well. So, I mean, the traumatic experience she had led this woman to say, and her husband, that she will never try to get pregnant again as long as she lives in Texas. Another woman got pregnant, had a very bad experience, got a staph infection, and now has so much scarring she might not be able to conceive again. So we are already seeing horrible, horrible things going on in this country. 22 million women now in this country don't have access to abortion, even in cases of rape, incest, or life of the mother. So again, we are seeing horrible, horrible things going on around the country. That's the bad news. The not as bad news is that I do think there are a lot of people around this country who've never had to really think about it. And I would tell you a lot of those people are in the Texas state legislature because right now they're all upset. I have I know some people I work with in Congress who used to be part of it and said that they are furious with pro-life groups because the pro-life groups told them they could vote for all these trigger laws because Roe would never be lifted. A Crimea River. So I do think there are a lot of people that never had to really think about what this might look like and what it means. And the forces, I think, are gathering. And what I hope we can do, I mean, most, this is kind of neither here nor there now that Roe's overturned, but most constitutional scholars would tell you the edifice of Roe was a little shaky, legally speaking. I am now hoping we can come up with a better plan going forward on how we rebuild these rights. Because, again, as fetuses became viable earlier and earlier, some of the pieces of, not just the privacy, right, but the pieces of it were starting to become more and more shaky. So I'm hoping we can rebuild it in a much better way.
I'm going to ask you just one more question before the rabbi gets up, as he was sort of half did, but he wasn't out of his seat yet. This is a little personal for me, and we talked about this earlier today. I worked for Justice Alito when he had my job as U.S. Attorney in the Reagan administration. He's only the third former United States Attorney to sit on the Supreme Court. The first two were in the 19th century. But I worked for him, and never in the 3 years I worked for him, I was the chief of the criminal division in that office, I never saw this side of his personality. He was at my wedding. He came up in 2009 to swear me in publicly as the U.S. Attorney, and I've been spectacularly disappointed in the legal analysis, if nothing else, but also the totally agenda-driven and what seems like an angry agenda-driven personality that has really sort of come to the surface in a way that I never anticipated, and I feel terrible about. On the other side, I have been spectacular. I'm totally in love with Liz Cheney, right? Who, by the way, doesn't think that Roe was good law and is anti-abortion and anti-choice, and is anti so many other things that I stand for. But to turn back to democracy is somebody who is totally aligned with Jamie Raskin in this one spectacular way. Jamie Raskin, of course, awesome. We're all in love with Jamie Raskin. So my last question for you is this: in the time you've been in Congress, which is now 4 years, almost 4 years, and I can't say whether I wish in the synagogue in a nonpartisan event whether I wish you 2 more years, but people know how I feel about you, the country. Who have you worked with who has uplifted you in a way that Liz Cheney has done in that sort of narrow but spectacularly important way for lots of us?
You kind of stole my answer.
Sorry.
Because it is Liz Cheney.
who you know. And I don't
Who I know, who I serve on the House Armed Services Committee with, who serves until January the state of Wyoming, which is, as you can imagine, incredibly different from the state of New Jersey. So not only do I differ with her on just about every single social issue that she could vote on, guns, etc. I differ with her on just about every economic issue that she wants to vote on, because the needs are so different and the way we run our states is so different. But that said, in a time when there were few, if any, acts of courage, she stood out to me because I think even Kinzinger, who I admire, I think knew that he was going to get redistricted out of his district. I don't think he planned to run again. You know, and I still think what he did was heroic and courageous, and I'm amazed by it. But Liz Cheney, imagine, if you will, for those of you who are maybe roughly my age, imagine you've gotten to a place, imagine you're a woman and maybe have had some trials and tribulations getting to a certain place of respect, and you achieve some level of respect and leadership in a caucus, conference, quite frankly, that has not valued women, and you are the senior most woman in the conference, and you really feel like you have a lot to offer, you have now achieved some level, after some years, some level of leadership and can really lead things in a direction you want, and some level of respect, and you are just about to tank almost every single relationship that you have, and people that have given you respect, that have told you good job, are now going to start giving you dirty looks in the hallway. And if you were sitting in this synagogue, you probably would have to sit whereas maybe before you were, in a prominent section, now you're going to find yourself sitting in the back and just coming in and then leaving before everything is over, so nobody can talk to you or look at you in and out as quietly as possible. So here's a woman who basically she was Republican royalty, she had leadership, and she didn't just vote for impeachment. She burned the House down. She took no prisoners. There were pathways for her where she probably could have come back, to the point where now someone, Elise Stefanik, who is a huge disappointment, speaking of disappointments, who's somebody I've been on a little panel about, some bipartisan blah, blah, blah. And next thing you know, she goes to Camp David and comes back a new woman. She's seen the light, and the light is Donald Trump, and now she's suddenly an acolyte and total MAGA Republican. Takes your place. That's who's going to take your place, somebody who has really no values and no moral center. So she has just so impressed me, and to the point I was sitting there, and there's a gentleman, Dutch Ruppersberger, who's a member from Maryland, who's been there quite a long time, and he goes, he said one day, he was sitting with me, he goes, I've seen a lot. I tell you what, I don't think I've ever seen anything like what that woman just did. It is just what this country needed. And I really can't stop being so impressed. And she is, oh, by the way, and I'm sure a nonpartisan way, helping my friend Alyssa Slotkin in Michigan right now, which has been great.
Okay, Rabbi.
So just to vary up the media a little bit, we're not going to take formal questions from the congregation or from the audience, but I have a little bit of time at the end to ask you a few questions. Actually, to ask both of you questions, since it's a privilege to have Paul not just as the moderator, but also his perspective. So I was thinking a little bit about what to ask or what to say. I figured actually I was going to reflect on my high holiday sermons. And
I was here, Mikey was not.
Yes.
I'm just saying.
And basically, Mikey, I'm going to just ask you my high holiday sermons. So one of the
Jill?
sermons, yes. So one of the sermons, the point that I made was that there are things in life, and Roe being one of them, that is now at this point, unfortunately, not active in the way that we would want it to be, where actually you have to sprint to stay still, and that sometimes, like resting on the win, actually means going backwards because other people want to take that away from you. Leaving Roe aside, what is something that you feel like you need to be sprinting right now to keep the status quo?
It feels like democracy. It really does. And it feels like there are so many things that we have to do or we have to have done yesterday. So civics education. I really feel like I took for granted, because I grew up during the Cold War, how important democracy was, and maybe our kids didn't see it. In fact, I was in Ukraine, and there was one young woman who was suggesting that, we not support the Ukrainians, and this wasn't our fight. And I turned to Tom Malinowski, actually, he was born in Poland during the Cold War, behind the Iron Curtain, and emigrated here. And I said, I just don't understand why people don't understand how important this is. And Tom Malinowski believes that NATO is one of the most important accomplishments of the United States and our leadership in the history of our country, that we ended land wars in Europe for a long period of time. And he said, well, think about it. My daughter, who's in her 20s, has not seen United States power at its apex and as a force of good. It's been much more mixed in the last 20 years. And I thought that was really interesting. So reminding people what democracy is, what our values are when we are used for good, and why that's so important. And that feels like we should have been doing that for like the last 20 years. It feels like we maybe let our foot off the gas because we thought everybody got it, and why it's so important. Shoring it up in so many areas, making sure that people understand that we care about their issues. And I think the way we keep democracy is we create a more fair economy, and we've let wealth kind of filter up to the top in so many different ways. And now we're trying to address that now, but again, we're doing it during a fragile economy as we're trying to make a more fair economy. That feels like, kind of, I'm already behind. Making investments in infrastructure, for example, which is going to help our country going forward. For the first time in 20 years, more than China, like it feels like, again, behind. So there's all these things right now, but a lot of it just feels like democracy. We've just got to get so much done in such a short period of time to, I think, restore our country's faith in this form of government.
Thank you. I think I'm getting the sign that no more questions, correct? All right.
Sorry, I have
we
one
need to
more
get to whatever your next thing is.
After the election.
It'll be a little
Yes,
more.
so thank you.
Sorry. That was pretty abrupt.
Thank you, Representative
Sorry,
Cheryl.
Sorry.
Thank you to Paul Fishman. Thank you to everybody else who's coming. Thank you for those who are online. If you are in our religious school, we're going to ask that you go back to your classes. If you are in my class, I'll meet you in the back in about 5 to 7 minutes, and we'll debrief there. Thank you, everyone.